Welcome to the second lesson on problems faced during merger. In this lesson, we will be looking at political problems between the Central Malaysian Government and the Singapore Government during the merger period. So you're expected to know four problems faced during merger, and these four problems can be divided into economic problems and political problems. We have looked at the economic problems in the previous lesson. They are disagreements regarding the common market, the failure to establish a common market that would remove import taxes, as well as disagreement regarding taxation, federal taxation when the Central Malaysian Government wanted to increase Singapore's federal tax contribution from 40 to 60%. So in this lesson, we'll be focusing purely on the political problems that were faced. Political here refers to the way Malaysia was governed. So there was a disagreement in political beliefs as well as a disagreement over the privileges for Malays. So the political problems, much like the economic problems, led to a lot of tension between the Central Malaysian Government and the Singapore Government during the merger period, contributing to the eventual separation in 1965. So the objectives of this lesson are firstly to be able to describe how disagreement in political beliefs led to tensions between the Singapore government and the federal government. Secondly, to be able to describe how disagreements over privileges for Malays led to tensions between the Singapore government and the federal government. To understand the disagreement in political beliefs, we have to first look at the political parties that controlled the Central Malaysian government and the Singapore government. The Central Malaysian government was controlled by the Alliance Party. You can see the symbol on the right, which is a boat. The Alliance Party, while being a single political party, was made up of three organizations: the United Malay National Organization, the Malaysian Chinese Association, and the Malaysian Indian Congress. Each organization represented the interests of one of Malaysia's three main racial communities. So UMNO represented Malay interests, Malaysian Chinese Association or MCA represented Chinese interests, and the MIC or Malaysian Indian Congress represented Indian interests. So the Alliance Party believed in communalism. Okay, do not confuse communalism for communism. They are two separate things. Okay, ism, when the word has ism attached to it, it usually refers to a set of beliefs. In this case, it is communalism, a system of governance where each community, in this case, racial community, looks after its own interests. The government in Singapore was controlled by the People's Action Party and continues to be controlled by the People's Action Party today. So the party symbol on the right, the lightning going through a circle, a blue circle, should be quite familiar to all of you. So the PAP, unlike the Alliance Party, was a single organization made up of members from different races. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see the leader of the PAP and also Singapore's Prime Minister at the time, Lee Kuan Yew, in the center, and you can see that around him are other PAP leaders of different racial backgrounds. So the PAP aimed to represent the interests of all Singaporeans, regardless of race. The PAP believed in multiracialism, another ism here meaning political belief. Multiracialism is a system of governance where all communities collaborate or cooperate to look after shared interests. So what was the disagreement in political beliefs? The Central Malaysian Government, controlled by the Alliance Party, believed in communalism, a system where each racial community represents their own interests in government. Whereas the Singapore Government, controlled by the People's Action Party, believed in multiracialism, a system where all racial communities collaborate to represent shared interests in government. So you must remember the names of the political beliefs: communalism and multiracialism, and you also must remember their definitions. Now let's move on to the second political problem faced during the merger period, the disagreement over special privileges. The Central Malaysian Government granted special privileges to Malays in Malaysia. These privileges made it easier for them to get jobs, enter universities, and obtain licenses to start businesses. So, for example, if there was a job opening in a Malaysian government agency, and there were only three applicants, a Malay applicant, a Chinese applicant, and an Indian applicant. The Malay applicant would have been given priority to get the job over the Chinese and Indian applicants. So this policy of granting special privileges was only given to Malays in Malaysia. Malays in Singapore were not granted special privileges under the Singapore government, even during the merger period. So the PAP were quite outspoken in their criticism of the Malaysian government's policy of granting special privileges to Malays. And as you can imagine, the Central Malaysian government was not very happy about being criticized by the PAP, and this led to quite a lot of tension between the two governments. So the following source, an extract from a speech by the Central Malaysian Government Finance Minister, Tan Siew Sin, um, demonstrates how governance worked in Malaysia, which was really quite different from how governance worked in Singapore. So it says that Malays, through UMNO being the organization within the Alliance Party, within the Central Malaysian government that represented Malay interests, were generous enough to relax citizenship laws of this country. Okay, so this meant that many Indians and Chinese were granted citizenship in Malaysian citizenship through the relaxation of these laws. The Chinese and Indian communities were actually considered immigrant communities in Malaysia, having only arrived in the country in the last 200 years or so. And the MCA, the Malay Chinese Association, representing the Chinese interests, and the Malaysian Indian Congress, representing Indian interests, agreed to continue the policy of preserving the special position of Malays. This special position, of course, granting them special privileges. So in this source that you can see that the MCA and MIC were able to attain citizenship, and in exchange, UMNO was able to attain MCA's and MIC's agreement to grant Malay special privileges. So in Malaysia, each race represented their own interests, be it through UMNO, MCA, or MIC, and they would negotiate with the other races to achieve what they wanted, instead of um, all three all three races um, pursuing shared interests. It was more of a um, negotiation type of dealing in the Central Malaysian government. So at this point, you might be wondering how come UMNO believed that the Malays in Malaysia should be given special privileges. So in this slide, you can see poverty in Malaysia by race after British colonialism. Source B is a table illustrating the incidence of poverty in Peninsular Malaysia. So this Peninsular Malaysia excludes Singapore, and it shows you in the red box the incidence of poverty in 1957 to 58, which is right after Malaysia gained independence um, from the British. Okay, at this point it would be Malaya because this is before merger, and it shows you poverty. Poverty means to be very poor, and it usually means to be poor to the point where you are um, unable to afford basic necessities. So it shows you poverty in Malaysia by race. So you have the Malay poverty rate, which is 70.5%, the Chinese poverty rate, which was 27.4%, and the Indian poverty rate, which was 35.7%. So you can see here that the Malay community was really much poorer than the Chinese and Indian communities after British colonialism. It was actually double. They actually had double the poverty rate of the Indian community and more than double the poverty rate of the Chinese community in Peninsular Malaysia. So why was there more poverty in the Malay community in Malaysia after colonialism? So C is an extract adapted from a research article on poverty in Malaysia that shows you how British colonialism in Malaysia led the Malay community to be poorer than the other communities. So it says from the 1850s to the 1930s, the British encouraged large-scale Chinese and Indian immigration to Malaya to meet the labor needs in the tin and mining industries and the rubber plantations, which were in the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia, where the large cities such as KL were developing. The Chinese were brought to work in the tin mines, while the Indians to work in rubber plantations. The Malays remained in the traditional subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture here refers to farming methods that produce enough food for the local population, but not enough food to export overseas to earn money, and were thus left out of the modern economy. So you can see during British colonialism, the Malays communities were largely left untouched, and such they did not develop along the Chinese and Indian communities, which were brought to the plantations and the mines, which were where the money was being made, and also they were closer to the large cities where they would have access to more jobs, more modern jobs, training opportunities, and opportunities to go to school. So, as a result, the Malay community ended up with a much higher rate of poverty after British colonialism, and um, the Alliance Party controlling the Central Malaysian Government saw special privileges as a way to help a community that had fallen behind the other communities due to the difference in different policies that the British government, colonial government, had in um, dealing with them during the colonial period. Okay, so for examination purposes, you're not required to know how come the Malay community in Malaysia ended up poorer than the Chinese and Indian communities after British colonialism, but you are required to understand the Central Malaysian government's view on special privileges. So you can take a look at the source in this slide, an extract from a speech by Jafar Alba, an Alliance Party member. So it says here, on the question of Malay privileges, which Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has made such a fuss about. Okay, so you can really see the tension created between the Alliance Party leaders and the PAB leaders through the previous criticism of the granting of special privileges to Malays in Malaysia. Mr. Lee has ignored the facts as they really are. In this land, the privileged Malays live in huts while the underprivileged Chinese live in palaces and have the best things in life. So of course, this is a little bit of an exaggeration to say that the richest Malays live in huts, whereas the poorest Chinese live in palaces. But what he's trying to point out here is the inequality between the Malay community and the Chinese communities. So why did the Central Malaysian Government believe that Malays in Malaysia should be granted special privileges? The Malay community in Malaysia was significantly poorer than the Chinese and Indian communities. So if you go back to that table, which shows you the poverty rates post British colonialism, it is undeniable that the Malay community was poorer, with rates of more than double the poverty rate of the Chinese and Indian communities. And hence, the Central Malaysian Government believed that special privileges would result in a more equal distribution of wealth because it would make it easier for um, the Malays in Malaysia to get jobs, to enter universities, to obtain licenses for businesses, and thus they would be more likely to be able to increase their wealth and more um, and success would be more attainable to them. So to them, special privileges was fair because it was given to a community that was in a very disadvantaged position and had not been given the same opportunities to develop during British colonialism as the Chinese or Indian communities. So what was the Singapore government's views on privileges for Malays? Why was Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and other PAP leaders so outspoken in their criticism of the practice of granting special privileges to Malays in Malaysia? So the following is an extract from a speech by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew during the merger period. The issue is whether we are going to have a multiracial Malaysia or a Malaysia where one race dominates the rest. I do not believe that giving Malays special privileges will help them solve their poverty. Special privileges will not help them to compete with Chinese or Indians in the long run. We should give our fellow Malay citizens every opportunity through education and training so that they can rise in one, maybe two generations to the same level that the Chinese and Indians have achieved. Some Alliance Party members call us anti-Malay, but we are pro-Malay and prepared to do more than them to help Malays advance. So why did the Singapore government believe that Malays in Malaysia should not be granted special privileges? Firstly, the Singapore government believed that special privileges threaten multiracialism because the foundation of multiracialism is that all races are equal, and if all races are equal, then they should be treated equally and no race should be granted special privileges. And as Mr. Lee Kuan Yew pointed out, special privileges might create a society where one race dominates the others because the special privileges makes it easier for them to succeed or makes them more important than the other races. Secondly, the Singapore government believed that special privileges would not benefit the Malays in the long run because by making it easier for them to attain jobs, enter universities, obtain business licenses, they would not become used to competing with the Chinese or Indian communities on equal terms, and thus they would always or they would end up becoming less capable than the Chinese or Indian communities in the long run. So what did the Singapore government then suggest, or what did they believe was a better way to reduce poverty in the Malay community in Malaysia? Okay, the Singapore government believed that they should make it easier for Malays to access education. So if you recall, one of the main reasons why the Malay community in Malaysia ended up poorer than the Chinese or Indian communities after colonialism was that because during colonialism, they were left mainly in the rural areas, the countrysides, where they did not have the same opportunities as the Chinese or Indian immigrant communities to go to school, to get job training, to have access to higher education in the form of universities, and thus they ended up poorer than the other communities. Of course, this wasn't as much of an issue in Singapore, where there aren't really rural areas or countrysides. However, the Malays in Singapore also did face some difficulty attaining higher education in Singapore because if you recall, the British were not very willing to fund Malay education, and also they were not likely to be able to they were not likely to enter mission schools, because the mission schools, of course, had the motive of converting the students to Christianity, which the Malay community was not likely to do. So the Singapore government believed that by granting them, by increasing the access to education, increasing the access to job training, they would eventually be able to, they would eventually develop, and they would be able to develop in a way that would make them equally competitive to the um, Indian and Chinese communities. So this rationale is exemplified by the proverb that you see on the right. On the photograph, it says it's a Chinese proverb, but I think that it's actually a proverb that is quite universal. Uh, so it says, give a man a fish and you feed him for days. So the idea here is that when you hand out things like jobs or business licenses, yes, you help them in the short term, but in the long term, you need to teach them how to fish, to give them the skills and the knowledge to be able to compete and survive in the long term. So with that, we've come to the end of this lesson. At this point, you should be able to describe how the disagreement in political beliefs led to tensions between the Singapore government and the Federal Malaysian government. You should also be able to describe how the disagreement over privileges for Malays led to tensions between the Singapore government and the Federal Malaysian government. Alright, so thank you and see you in the next lesson.